This is a story of Little Klaus and Big Klaus. I mean, I guess you could say Claus because it's spelled like Claus, but I think then you might think it's a Christmas story, and it's not a Christmas story, so we're going to go with Klaus by Hans Christian Andersen. Little Klaus and Big Klaus. There was a town where two men had the very same name. Both of them were named Klaus, but one owned 4 horses while the other had only one. In order to tell them apart, people called the man with 4 horses Big Klaus and the man with only 1 horse Little Klaus. Now we're going to hear what happened between those two because this is a real story. All week long, Little Klaus had to do the plowing for Big Klaus, lending him his only horse. Then Big Klaus would help him in return with all 4 of his horses, but only once a week, and that was on Sunday. Hee-yah! How Little Klaus would crack his whip at all 5 horses. They might as well have belonged to him on that one day. The sun shone so wondrously, and all the bells in the tower rang, summoning people to church. Everyone was dressed in their best, walking with their hymnals under their arms on their way to hear the pastor preach. And they looked at Little Klaus, who was plowing with 5 horses, and he was so pleased that he cracked his whip again and shouted, "Giddy up, all my horses!" "You shouldn't say that," said Big Klaus. "Only one of those horses is yours." Big Klaus is a little bit of a stickler for the details. And you'll see, like, he gets stuck on that. I have read this story before. But when someone else passed by on his way to church, Little Klaus forgot that he wasn't supposed to say that, and he shouted, "Giddy up, all my horses!" "All right, now I really must ask you to stop that," said Big Klaus, "because if you say it one more time, I'm going to strike your horse on the forehead, and he'll drop dead on the spot, and that will be the end of him." "Well, I certainly won't say it again," said Little Klaus. But when people came past and nodded hello, he was so pleased and thought it looked so splendid that he had his 5 horses plowing his field that he cracked his whip and shouted, "Giddy up, all my horses!" "I'll giddy up your horses," said Big Klaus, and he seized the tethering mallet and struck Little Klaus's only horse on the forehead so that it fell to the ground, stone dead. I'm often amazed, like, these are not people who make light threats. Like, in these stories, they always seem to follow through with them. And I think one of the beautiful things about the contrast of the stories from the past is that we would never do it that way today. But it's real special to see how much our humanity has changed. And not that I'm judging such stories, but like if you give a mouse a cookie, like you're not really going to see yourself and your own growth in stories like that, even though they definitely have a place in the codex. I think that stories like this are really important too. Just like you're not always going to listen to Beethoven, sometimes you're going to listen to, like pop music, like Taylor Swift or something. But you can't only listen to Taylor Swift. Sometimes you have to listen to Beethoven because that feels different to you. And just like these stories are different. So you need all the kinds of stories that there are. And it's real important, in my opinion, not to judge art. The art that appeals to you and you want to consume, you don't have to choose art that seems yucky to you. But this is good. This is, even though he's like murdering a horse. Okay, so Little Klaus, "Oh no, now I have no horse at all," said Little Klaus, and he began to cry. Later, he flayed the horse and let the hide dry in the wind. So that means he took the skin off the horse. Then he stuffed it in a sack that he hoisted onto his back and set off for town to sell his horsehide. He had such a long way to go. He had to pass through a big dark forest, and a terrible storm came up. He completely lost his way, and before he found the right road, dusk had fallen, and it was much too far to reach town or to go back home before night came. Close to the road stood a large farm. The shutters on all the windows were closed, and yet there was a glimpse of light above. Surely they'll let me spend the night there, thought little Klaus, and he went over and knocked. The farmer's wife opened the door, but when she heard what he wanted, she told him to keep on going. Her husband wasn't home, and she didn't take in strangers. Well, then I guess I'll have to sleep outside, said little Klaus, and the farmer's wife shut the door in his face. To be fair, I don't think she's being mean. I don't know that I would want a stranger to come into my house either. Your heart can tell you when something is right to do, and I don't necessarily think she's unkind. And we've also noticed that they're not the most open-hearted people with their horse clonking and all that. Nearby stood a big haystack, and between the haystack and house a little shed had been built with a flat thatched roof. I can sleep up there, said little Klaus when he saw the roof. That would make a lovely bed. And I'm sure the stork isn't going to fly down and bite me on the leg. A real live stork was standing on the roof where it had made a nest. So little Klaus climbed up onto the shed, lay down, and turned onto his side to settle in properly. The wooden shutters on the windows of the house didn't quite meet at the top, which meant that he could peek into the room. A great feast had been laid out with wine and a roast and such a lovely fish. The farmer's wife and the deacon were sitting at the table all alone. She was pouring wine for him, and he began with the fish because he was awfully fond of fish. If only I could have a bite too, said little Klaus, craning his neck toward the window. Lord, what a lovely cake he could see in there. Oh, yes, it was quite a feast. Then he heard someone come riding along the road toward the house. It was the woman's husband on his way home. Now, it's true that he was a good man, but he had a strange affliction. He couldn't stand to see deacons. Deacons are like a person from the church. It's not necessarily the highest person, the pastor who gives the sermon, but it's like a kind of like a secondary worker in the church. If he caught sight of a deacon, he would grow quite furious. That was also why the deacon had to come visit the woman when he knew that her husband wasn't home. And that's why the good woman had set out for him the best food she could offer. When they heard her husband coming, they were both terrified. The woman told the deacon to climb into a big empty chest that stood in the corner, which he did because he knew full well that the poor man couldn't stand the sight of a deacon. The woman quickly hid all the wonderful food and wine inside her baking oven because if her husband saw it, he was sure to ask what was going on. Oh no, sighed little Klaus up on the shed when he saw all the food disappear. Is somebody up there? Asked the farmer, peering up at little Klaus. Why are you lying up there? Come on into the house. Then little Klaus told him how he had lost his way and asked if he might stay the night. Yes, of course, said the farmer, but first we'll have a bite to eat. The woman welcomed them both, set dishes on a long table, and brought them a big bowl of porridge. The farmer was hungry and ate with gusto, but little Klaus couldn't help thinking about the wonderful roast, fish, and cake that he knew were hidden in the oven. Under the table at his feet, he had put the sack with the horsehide in it, because we all know, after all, that this is what he had brought from home to sell in town. That's why he was there. The porridge was not at all to his liking, so he stepped on his sack, and the dry horsehide inside creaked quite loudly. Hush, said little Klaus to his sack, but at the same instant he stepped on it again, and it creaked even louder than before. Tell me, what do you have in your bag? Asked the farmer. Oh, it's a troll, said little Klaus. He says we shouldn't eat the porridge because he has conjured a whole oven full of roast and fish and cake. "Is that right?" said the farmer, and quickly opened the oven. There he saw all the wonderful food that his wife had hidden, but he now thought the troll in the bag had conjured it up. His wife didn't dare say a word, but set the food on the table at once. And so they ate the fish and the roast and the cake. Then little Klaus stepped on his sack again, making the hide creak. "What's he saying now?" asked the farmer. "He says," said little Klaus, "that he has also conjured up 3 bottles of wine for us, and they're standing over in the corner by the oven." Then the woman had to bring out the wine she had hidden, and the farmer drank and grew quite merry. A troll like the one that little Klaus had in his bag was something that he would certainly like to own. "Can he also conjure up the devil?" asked the farmer. "That's someone I'd really like to see now that I'm feeling so merry." "Yes," said little Klaus, "my troll can do anything I ask. Isn't that right?" he said as he stepped on the bag, making it creak. Did you hear him say yes? But the devil looked so horrid that you wouldn't want to look at him. "Oh, I'm not the least bit afraid. How bad do you think he could look?" "Well, he's going to look exactly like a deacon." "Whoa," said the farmer. "That's ghastly, all right. I must tell you that I can't stand the sight of deacons. But that doesn't matter because I'll know it's the devil, so it won't bother me as much as a deacon." "I'm feeling brave now, but don't let him come too close." "Let me ask my troll," said little Klaus, and he stepped on the bag, cupping his ear. "What does he say?" "He says that you can go over and open the chest that's standing in the corner, and you'll see the devil moping inside. But you have to hold on to the lid so he doesn't get out." "Come and help me hold on to it," said the farmer, and he went over to the chest where his wife had hidden the real deacon, who sat there completely terrified. The farmer lifted the lid slightly and peeked inside. "Whoa!" he yelled, jumping back. "I saw him all right, and he looks just like our deacon." Oh, that was terrible. After that, they had to have a drink. And then they kept on drinking until late into the night. "You've got to sell me that troll," said the farmer. "Ask whatever price you like. Why, I'd even give you a whole bushel full of money." "No, I can't do that," said Klaus. "Just think how much I'll gain from owning this troll." "Oh, but I'd certainly like to have it," said the farmer, and he kept on begging. "All right," said little Klaus at last. "Since you've been kind enough to give me shelter for the night, I can't refuse. You can have the troll for a bushel of money." A bushel is a big bucket. It's like this big around. "But I want the bushel to be full to the brim." "And that's what you'll get," said the farmer. "But you have to take that chest over there with you. I refuse to have it in the house for even an hour longer. There's no telling whether he's still inside." Little Klaus gave the farmer the sack with the dried horsehide and got in return a whole bushel of money, full to the brim. The farmer even presented him with a big wheelbarrow for carrying the money in the chest. "Farewell," said little Klaus, and then he set off with his money and the big chest in which the deacon was still sitting. On the other side of the woods was a big, deep river. The water was running so fast that it was almost impossible to swim against the current. A big new bridge had been built across it. Little Klaus stopped in the middle of the bridge and said very loudly so that the deacon inside the chest would hear him, "Well, what do I need this stupid chest for? It's so heavy, it feels like it's full of rocks. I'm getting awfully tired of carting it around, so I think I'll throw it in the river. If it floats home to me, that's fine, but if it doesn't, it won't matter at all." Then he grabbed one handle of the chest and lifted it slightly as if he were going to shove it into the water. "No, stop!" yelled the deacon inside the chest. "Let me out!" "Ooh!" said little Klaus, pretending to be scared. He's still inside. I've got to toss it in the river as quick as I can so he'll drown. Oh no, shouted the deacon. I'll give you a whole bushel full of money if you don't. Well, that's a different story, said little Klaus, and opened the chest. The deacon crawled out at once, shoved the empty chest into the water, and went off to his house, where he gave little Klaus a whole bushel full of money. Little Klaus already had 1 bushel from the farmer. Now his whole wheelbarrow was full of money. Look at that. I certainly did get a good price for that horse, he said to himself when he came back to his own house and dumped all the money in a big heap in the middle of the floor. Big Klaus will be annoyed when he finds out how rich I've become from my only horse. But I'm not going to come right out and tell him about it. Then he sent a boy over to Big Klaus to borrow a bushel measure. I wonder what he wants that for, thought Big Klaus, and smeared tar inside the bottom of that so that a little of whatever was being weighed would stick to it. And it did, because when he got the bushel measure back, there were 3 new silver 8 skilling coins stuck to it. Skilling is their type of money in Denmark. What's this? Said Big Klaus, and ran right over to see little Klaus. Where did you get all this money? Oh, I got it for my horse hide. I sold it last night. That was certainly a good price, said Big Klaus, and he raced back home, picked up an axe, and struck every one of his 4 horses on the forehead. Then he skinned them and drove into town with the hides. Hides, hides, who wants to buy hides? He shouted through the streets. All the shoemakers and tanners came running and asked him how much he wanted for the hides. A bushel of money for each of them, said Big Klaus. Are you crazy? They all said. Do you think we have bushels of money? Hides, hides, who wants to buy hides? He shouted again. But to everyone who asked how much the hides cost, he replied, a bushel of money. He's trying to make fools of us, they all said. Then the shoemakers picked up their straps and tanners their leather aprons, and they all started beating Big Klaus. I just have to pause because there's a part later too where Big Klaus expresses that he's concerned he's being made a fool of. But if you consider these townspeople and also Big Klaus, the circumstances haven't changed. But the meaning they interpret from the situation is that they're a fool and that Big Klaus, he believes that he's a fool. Otherwise, you can't get upset if someone calls you a fool, because if you don't believe you are one, then it just rolls right away. So keep that in mind when you think about all these people concerned about being made a fool of, because they're agreeing to it. Hides, hides, they jeered at him. Oh, yes, we'll give you a hide that bleeds like a pig. Now get out of town, they shouted. Maybe a little bit of a big response for his offering there. They didn't have to be so unkind. They shouted at him, and Big Klaus had to rush off as fast as he could. He had never been beaten so badly in his life. Well, he said when he got home, little Klaus is going to pay for this. I'm going to murder him for this. And so now I have to ask you, and you, Simon, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
So now he's going to blame little Klaus. But isn't he the one that didn't even listen to the whole story? He killed all those horses, and then he expected that he was going to get the same pay for it as little Klaus did. And he didn't even do any of the interesting marketing that little Klaus did. You know, have that interesting story about the troll. He didn't know about that. And so, but the circumstances were the same. And so he perceived he should get the same outcome. Right? So he's the one that's being foolish, if you ask me. And now he's blaming little Klaus. Do you think it's little Klaus's fault?
Asking me?
Yeah.
No, not really.
No, it's not. It's Big Klaus should have slowed down a little bit.
Not have killed the horse.
Yeah.
They're amazing. They're so great.
Yeah, so you're going to see him do a whole bunch of things where he didn't really think about it. He just wanted the same outcome. He didn't actually know how little Klaus did it. Instead, he just jumped in and guessed, and then when it turned out wrong, he blames little Klaus. We'll see how that's going to work out for Big Klaus. But back at little Klaus's house, his grandmother had just died. Now, it's true that she had been terribly ill-tempered and mean toward him, but even so, he was quite sad. Which I also think that's a really good thing to include in the story, because people do have different parts of them that they express, and there are no people who are just good and people who are just bad. So even though his grandmother was mean to him, he still loved her and grieved when she died. And that's true of everybody. Don't you think that's right, Simon?
Not everyone.
Do you think some people are, like here later it says... Most people have good and bad in them?
Mainly me, though.
Okay. Okay, so he was quite sad. He took the dead woman and put her in his warm bed to see whether she might come back to life. There she would lie all night long while he slept in the corner, sitting on a chair. That was something he had done before. Sleep on the chair is what he had done before. He hadn't stayed up all night with his grandmother, who he thought was dead. But she actually is dead. As he was sitting there that night, the door opened and Big Klaus came in with an axe. He knew where little Klaus's bed stood, and he went right over and struck the dead grandmother on the forehead, thinking it was little Klaus. "Take that," he said. "Now you won't make a fool of me anymore." And then he went back home. "What a mean and evil man," said little Klaus. "He wanted to murder me. But it's a good thing the old lady was already dead, or he would have taken her life." Then he dressed his old grandmother in her Sunday best and borrowed a horse from his neighbor, harnessed it to his wagon, and put his old grandmother on the back seat so that she wouldn't fall out when he started driving. Then they headed off through the woods. When the sun came up, they were outside a big inn where little Klaus stopped and went inside to get a bite to eat. The innkeeper was very, very rich, and he was also a good man, but hot-tempered, as if there were pepper and tobacco inside of him. "Good morning," he said to little Klaus. "You've put on your fine clothes awfully early today." "Yes," said little Klaus, "I'm going to town with my old grandmother. She's sitting outside in the wagon, and I can't get her to come indoors. Would you mind taking her a glass of mead?" Which is it's like a kind of like beer, and it's got honey. It's made with honey, but it's a drink that people enjoyed in the olden days. "But you'll have to speak up because she doesn't hear very well." "Why, certainly," said the innkeeper. He poured a big glass of mead and took it outside to the dead grandmother, who was propped up in the wagon. "Here's a glass of mead from your grandson," said the innkeeper. But the dead woman didn't say a word, just sat there without moving. "Didn't you hear me?" shouted the innkeeper. But "Here's a glass of mead from your grandson." Once again he shouted the same thing, and then one more time. But when she didn't budge in the slightest, he got angry and tossed the glass of mead right in her face so that it ran down her nose. And she toppled over backward into the wagon because she had merely been propped up but wasn't tied down. "What's this?" shouted little Klaus as he came running out the door and grabbed the innkeeper by the shirt front. "You've gone and killed my grandmother. Just look at that big hole in her forehead." "Oh, what bad luck," cried the innkeeper, wringing his hands. "It's all the fault of my bad temper. Dear little Klaus, I'll give you a whole bushelful of money and pay for your grandmother's burial as if she were my own. But don't say a word or they'll chop off my head, and that would be awful." So little Klaus got a whole bushelful of money, and the innkeeper buried the grandmother as if she were his own. So that's interesting too, because it's all based on what you believe about yourself. And he believed like he was a good person, except for he believed that he had this hot temper. And so then that's where he's going to put his blame. This is a great story about blame and responsibility. Great. So he got the bushel full of money, and then the grandmother got buried, which was great. As soon as little Klaus got back home with all the money, he at once sent his boy over to see Big Klaus to ask if he could borrow a bushel measure. "What's this?" said Big Klaus. "I thought I killed him. I'm going to have to see this for myself." And so he took the bushel measure over to little Klaus in person. "Where on earth did you get all that money?" he asked, opening his eyes wide when he saw how much more little Klaus had accumulated. "It was my grandmother, not me, that you killed," said little Klaus. "But now I've sold her for a bushel full of money." "That was certainly a good price," said Big Klaus, and he rushed home, picked up an axe, and promptly killed his old grandmother. I have to say, many people might learn from their past experience. Like, I didn't get the same price for the horse hides. Maybe I should take a pause before killing my grandmother for what I think is going to be it's not really a guaranteed bushel full of money. But maybe he will get the bushel full. Like, who am I to say? He put her in his wagon, drove her into town to the apothecary's shop, and asked him whether he wanted to buy a dead body. "Who is it, and where did you get it?" Good questions, asked the apothecary. "It's my grandmother," said Big Klaus. "I've killed her for a bushel full of money." "Good Lord," said the apothecary. "You don't know what you're saying. Don't say things like that, or you could lose your head." And then he told him exactly what a dreadful, evil thing he had done, and what a bad person he was, and that he ought to be punished. Big Klaus was so scared that he leaped straight from the apothecary's shop into his wagon, cracked his whip at the horses, and raced off home. The apothecary and everyone else thought he was mad, crazy, and so they let him go where he liked. They didn't want to fool with him. "You're going to pay for this," said Big Klaus when he was out on the road. "Oh, yes, you're going to pay for this, little Klaus." As soon as he got home, he took the biggest sack he could find and went over to little Klaus and said, "You've made a fool of me again." This is just so well written. You have made a fool of me. And then he describes how he did. "First, I killed my horses, then my old grandmother. It's all your fault, and you're never going to trick me again." And he grabbed little Klaus around his waist and stuffed him into the sack. Then he slung him over his back and shouted, "Now I'm going to take you out and drown you." But it just really emphasizes again, like, you can go ahead and kill little Klaus, but you are still a fool, and you'll still have you with you. I'm not talking to you, but Big Klaus, of course. Oh, it was a long walk to reach the river, and little Klaus wasn't easy to carry. The road passed very close to the church where the organ was playing, and people were singing so beautifully inside. Then Big Klaus put down the sack holding little Klaus right next to the church door, thinking it might do him good to go inside and listen to a hymn first. Because sometimes when you're on your way to drown someone, you want to listen to a hymn first, which is the song. It's like a church song, if you don't know. What? So Big Klaus went inside because little Klaus couldn't get out of the bag. "Oh me, oh my," sighed little Klaus from inside the sack. He twisted and turned, but it was impossible for him to loosen the cord. At that moment, an old cattle driver with chalk-white hair and a big walking stick in his hand came by. He was driving a big herd of cows and bulls in front of him. They trampled over the sack that Klaus was in, turning it onto its side. "Oh my," sighed little Klaus. "I'm so young, but I'm already headed for heaven." "And what a poor man am I," said the cattle driver. "Here I am so old, but it's not yet my time to go." "Open the sack," shouted little Klaus. "Climb in and take my place, and you'll end up in heaven at once." "Oh, I'd like that very much," said the cattle driver, untying the sack, and little Klaus jumped right out. "Could you take care of the cattle?" said the old man, and he climbed into the bag, which little Klaus tied up, and then went on his way, taking along the cows and bulls. A little while later, Big Klaus came out of the church and hoisted the sack onto his back, thinking that it was certainly a lot lighter, because the old cattle driver was no more than half the weight of little Klaus. "How easy it is to carry him now." "Well, that's probably because I've been listening to a hymn." Yeah, that's probably why. Then he went over to the river, which was deep and wide, threw the sack with the old cattle driver into the water, and shouted after him, thinking he was little Klaus. "Take that! Now you won't be making a fool out of me anymore." Right. Then he headed home, but when he came to the crossroads, he met little Klaus walking along with all his cattle. "What's this?" said Big Klaus. "Didn't I drown you?" "Yes, you did," said little Klaus. "You threw me in the river less than half an hour ago." "But where did you get all these wonderful cattle?" asked Big Klaus. "Oh, they're sea cattle," said little Klaus. "Let me tell you the whole story. And by the way, thanks for drowning me, because now I'm back on my feet, and let me tell you, I'm as rich as I can be. I was so scared when I was inside that sack, and the wind whistled in my ears when you threw me off the bridge and into the cold water. I sank straight to the bottom, but I didn't hurt myself, because the loveliest soft grass grows down there. That's where I landed, and the bag was opened at once. The loveliest maiden, wearing chalk-white clothing and a little green wreath on her wet hair, took my hand and said, 'Is that you, little Klaus? Well, first let me give you these cattle.' That's what we always do. 5 miles up the road, there's another whole herd that I want you to have." Then I saw that the river was a great highway for the sea folk. Down on the bottom, they were walking and driving all the way from the sea toward land to the place where the river ends. It was so lovely with flowers and the freshest of grass and fish swimming in the water. They flitted around my ears like the birds in the air. How handsome the people were, and how many cattle there were, ambling along the ditches and fences. "But why did you come back to us so soon?" asked Big Klaus. "That's not what I would have done if it was so charming down there." "Well, you see," said little Klaus, "it really was very cunning of me. You heard me say that the mermaid told me that 5 miles up the road, and by the road she means river, of course, since she can't travel any other way, there was a whole herd of cattle waiting for me. I happen to know where the river starts to bend, first one way and then the other, making a whole detour. It's much shorter, if you can do it, to come up here on land and head straight across the river. That way I saved almost 2.5 miles and reached my sea cattle much quicker." "Oh, you certainly are a lucky man," said Big Klaus. "Do you think I could get some sea cattle too if I went down to the bottom of the river?" And that's the moment. I mean, he does this continually. Big Klaus constantly gives away his power. Like, I would say, Big Klaus, what do you think? Does it seem reasonable to you that you would get cattle if you go down to the bottom of the river? But no, he again outsources his brain to little Klaus. That's sort of his ruination. I just have to point it out. The outsourcing of the brain and the belief in luck. So he asked him, "Do you think I could get some sea cattle too if I went to the bottom of the river?" "Oh, yes, I imagine so," said little Klaus. "But I can't carry you in a sack to the river. You're much too heavy for me. But if you walk there yourself and then climb into the bag, I'd be more than happy to throw you in." Well, I'm sure he would. "Thanks so much," said Big Klaus. "But if I don't get any sea cattle when I get there, I'm going to give you a big beating, believe me. Believe me. Okay. Oh no, don't be so mean, little Klaus said. And then they went down to the river. The cattle were so thirsty that when they saw the water, they ran as fast as they could down the slope to drink. Look how fast they're moving, said little Klaus. They're longing to go back to the bottom. And so that is the genius of little Klaus. Like, he sees a circumstance, he sees what is, and that's the cattle are running down to the river. And then he gives his interpretation, which is a lie, that they want to go down to the river because that was their home. When the reality is they're going down there to drink because they have never been in the river and they're thirsty because they're cattle. But again, it's so charming to hear that from someone else that it often makes us not ask ourselves, is this reasonable? And that's what happened to Big Klaus. He was so caught up in the story that little Klaus told him that, he believed all of his stories. And none of them worked out. None of them worked out. And he didn't have a good history with him. And yet, he's not really what you'd call a deep thinker. Okay. So he says the cattle are longing to go back down to the bottom of the river. Yes, but help me first, said Big Klaus. Put me ahead of those cattle. I need to get in the sack and so forth. But help me, otherwise I'll give you a beating. Then he climbed into the big sack that was lying across the back of one of the bulls. Put a rock inside because otherwise I'm afraid I won't sink, said Big Klaus. Oh, I'm sure you will, said little Klaus. But just the same, he put a big rock in the sack, tied the cord tight, and then gave it a shove. Plop! Big Klaus landed in the river and promptly sank to the bottom. I'm afraid he's not going to find any cattle, said little Klaus. And then he headed home with all he had. Maybe Big Klaus will carry some of the lessons into the next life. I think it's a very fun story. I loved sharing it with you. And with you, Simon. And until the next time.